When I was 13, my parents decided to send me to a camp designed to help kids get fit. In reality, it was more of a weight loss camp. From the moment I arrived, everything about it seemed off. The food was bland and unappetizing, the exercise routines were exhausting, and the counselors had a knack for making us feel miserable. We were housed in dorms on a college campus, with 2 girls per room. I was hopeful that I might find a friend, and my roommate Emily seemed like a promising choice. We quickly bonded over our shared dislike for the camp. We spent many late nights talking about how much we hated it and how we could escape. Emily had been there for a while. Her parents had signed her up for the entire summer. My stay was only 2 weeks. One day, another girl named Lisa approached me with a warning about Emily. Lisa said that Emily had a reputation for causing trouble, and that previous roommates had either left early or moved rooms because of her. I thought Lisa was just spreading rumors and decided to ignore her. The camp had a weekly outing to a local pool, which was a welcome break from the usual routine. Emily and I were excited and quickly claimed some chairs for our things. Emily hadn't passed the swim test, so we agreed to go our separate ways for a while. After I passed the test, I jumped into the pool and started floating, enjoying the rare chance to relax. After some time, Emily called me over to the deep end of the pool. She said she had something to show me. I swam over, curious, but suddenly she grabbed my neck and pushed me underwater. Fear hit me hard as I struggled to get free. I fought back with all my strength, eventually managing to break free and swim to the edge of the pool. I climbed out, gasping for air, and looked back. Emily was just standing there, staring at me. I ran to the bathroom, my heart pounding. I called my mom, trying to explain what had happened, but she didn't seem to believe me. I stayed in the bathroom, avoiding the pool area, until it was time to leave. I clung to the counselors on the way back to camp, afraid to be alone. Back at the camp, a counselor took my phone away. I lied and said I didn't have one, just borrowed someone else's. They accepted this explanation and informed me that I would be moved to a new room the following day, but I had to spend one more night with Emily. I begged to be moved immediately, but they refused to listen. That night I barely slept. Emily stayed awake, her eyes fixed on me throughout the night. I kept my phone with 911 ready to dial, prepared to call for help if needed. The hours dragged on, and I felt a mix of fear and relief when morning finally arrived. The next day I was moved to a new room in a different building. My parents came to pick me up early, as my foot was hurt from an earlier accident. They were furious when they learned about the incident with Emily and immediately confronted the camp officials. As we were leaving, I overheard 2 counselors talking about extra precautions for Emily and a security issue. I couldn't catch all the details, but their conversation sounded serious. Back at home, my parents continued to deal with the camp, but I was left with unsettling questions. What was the camp really preparing for? What could have happened if I hadn't been moved? The whole experience left me feeling deeply uneasy and wondering what might have transpired if I had stayed. I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched and the dread that came with it. The camp's behavior and the counselor's reaction left me feeling like there was more going on than anyone was willing to admit. I began to question what I had seen and if I had missed any signs. The entire experience was a reminder of how unpredictable and frightening people can be, especially when you're trapped in a situation with nowhere to turn. Even after returning home, the memory of that day lingered. The fear and tension from the pool and the sleepless night with Emily stayed with me. It made me wary of trusting people too quickly and left me questioning the true nature of the camp's operations. I was left wondering what kind of precautions were really in place and whether the camp had other hidden issues. The unsettling feeling of being unsafe stayed with me long after I had left, a reminder of the dangers that can lurk even in seemingly controlled environments. A few years ago, my best friend and I decided we needed another camping trip. We loved the outdoors and aimed to camp a couple of times a month. It was late November in Virginia, and the weather was freezing cold. Our girlfriends had been asking to join us, even though we usually camp in rough conditions. Surprisingly, they wanted to come, so we planned a trip for that weekend. By Saturday, we had our gear packed and hit the road, heading west into the mountains. As we approached our secret spot, it was getting colder and rain started to fall. I could see my girlfriend getting anxious about setting up camp in such wet conditions. My friend and I reassured her it would be fine, as we were used to these conditions. We reached the spot, a scenic overlook where we parked to enjoy the view of the mountains. However, night had fallen, and all we could see were city lights far in the distance. It was raining hard, and the temperature had dropped to about 34 degrees. The wind was howling as we unloaded the car, and I noticed my girlfriend's excitement turning to discomfort. Our secret spot was a small trail leading down a steep rock scramble, about 75 feet to the bottom of the cliff. It wasn't an official trail, but a spot we used for its seclusion. We always descended carefully to avoid injury. I had all my gear out and was ready to head down the trail. My girlfriend and I walked about 50 yards away from the car to the beginning of the trail and waited for my friend and his girlfriend. After a few minutes of waiting, I decided to check on them. I heard my friend and his girlfriend arguing. They had locked the keys in the car. It was now close to 10 p.m., freezing and raining. We had no cell service, and the nearest town was 20 miles away. I was frustrated, but my main concern was getting my girlfriend warm. I told my friend we would start setting up the fire and that I would return to help with the car situation later. We turned on our headlamps and began descending the rocky trail. The rain and mist made it nearly impossible to see, as the fog illuminated by our headlamps obstructed our view. We carefully made our way down, passing gear between us, moving slowly to avoid accidents. About 10 minutes from the bottom, my girlfriend pointed out something. I squinted through the fog and saw a tarp on the rocks. I figured someone had lost it and was excited to find a free tarp. As I got closer, I noticed a shopping basket with snack wrappers in it. My girlfriend looked terrified. I thought she was overreacting, but then I saw something move under the tarp. My mind refused to believe it, but the tarp was definitely moving. I looked at my girlfriend, who was backing up the incline. I turned back to the tarp and saw it moving again. Someone was under it, waking up. My heart raced. I told my girlfriend to run. She scrambled up the rocks and I followed, turning off my light and listening. I could hear the person shifting stones below. They had woken up and might be coming after us. I tried to stay calm, wondering if someone was lost or injured. I called out to see if they needed help, but there was no response. We made it back to the car and my girlfriend was in tears, understandably scared. My friend and his girlfriend were also freaked out about the car keys and the mysterious person. We huddled under a tarp for warmth while my friend tried to get cell service. Finally, my friend reached a locksmith, who arrived after a costly wait. The locksmith warned us about the area's dangerous reputation. He told us about mysterious disappearances and murders in the region, implying that some people hide away there for a reason. We decided not to camp that night and drove back home. The car ride silent and tense. I still wonder about that person. Were they on the run or just an unprepared camper? How did they get there with no car or gear? Why didn't they have a fire going? The area was not one where a homeless person could survive easily. It made me realize that people can be a bigger threat in the wilderness than animals. Reflecting on it, I regret taking my girlfriend to that spot under those conditions. Illegally camping, the dark, the rain, and lack of cell service all made it a risky situation. I was overconfident in my camping skills and didn't consider external threats. If something had happened, no one would have found us. I was selfish and naive. Since then, I don't set up camp at night, and our girlfriends no longer ask to join us on these trips. We haven't returned to that spot, and I don't plan to. Every summer, my family would escape to our camping timeshare. My dad had to work Monday through Thursday, so he would join us at the campground only from Friday to Sunday. The place was perfect for kids. A pool, miniature golf, basketball courts, and a single entrance that made it feel secure. My mom, confident in the safety of the site, let us roam freely within the grounds. I was around 8 years old at the time, though small for my age, so I often looked younger. One summer, I met a boy who was camping with his single father for a few days. The boy and I hit it off quickly. He frequently visited our campsite, and we spent hours playing together. When they left, I felt a pang of sadness. His father reassured me that they would return soon, which gave me some comfort. A few weeks later, the man returned to the campground. It was right after my mom had left for her usual shower. He told me that his son would come back that week and asked where my parents were. I mentioned that my dad wouldn't be there until Friday and that my mom was currently in the shower. He nodded and said goodbye, leaving me alone at the campsite. The next day, he showed up again at the same time. This time, he seemed even more eager. He told me that he had found a litter of kittens and asked if I wanted one. I was thrilled. He explained that the kittens were now in his truck because he didn't want them to get too hot. I was excited and followed him as he led the way toward the entrance of the campground where his truck was parked. As we walked, a sense of unease began to creep over me. The usual lively buzz of the campground felt strangely muted. The trees seemed darker, and the path to the entrance seemed longer than usual. I kept glancing back at the camp, where the pool and courts lay silent, their usual activity replaced by an unsettling quiet. We reached the truck, which was parked outside the gates beyond the safety of the campgrounds. I hesitated. The truck was parked in a secluded spot, surrounded by dense trees and shadows. My instincts screamed that something was off, but I pushed the feeling aside. The man had seemed friendly before, and I had seen him with his son, so he didn't seem like a stranger. Just then, my dad's car appeared around the corner. He had managed to get the day off work to spend some extra time with us. When he saw me with the man, his expression shifted instantly from casual to alarmed. He approached us quickly, his face serious and tense. He asked me what was going on in a voice that left no room for questions. I told him about the kittens and the man's offer. Without another word, my dad told me to run back to our campsite. His tone brooked no argument, and I could sense the urgency in his voice. I didn't fully understand why, but I sprinted back, my heart racing. The path back seemed to stretch endlessly, the shadows closing in around me. When I reached our campsite, my dad arrived not long after, visibly shaken. He sat me down and told me in no uncertain terms that I should never, under any circumstances, go anywhere alone with an adult, even if I thought I knew them. He explained that there are people who can hide their true intentions behind a friendly facade. I was confused but scared by his serious tone. Years later, my mom revealed the full story. My dad had confronted the man outside the gates, and it had escalated into a violent confrontation. My dad, who had always been protective but never violent, had beaten the man up. He then called the police, who arrived quickly and took the man away. The incident was handled quietly, but the campground felt different for the rest of the summer. The revelation shook me to my core. I had been so close to a dangerous situation, blinded by trust and innocence. The unsettling memory of that day lingered, a reminder of how easily safety can be compromised. I realized that the man had used the guise of friendship to lure me away, and I was lucky to have had my dad there to intervene. Now, every time I think back to that summer, I'm haunted by the thought of what could have happened if my dad hadn't arrived in time. The familiar faces and friendly gestures can sometimes mask darker intentions, and the memory of those silent, shadowy trees outside the campground gates serves as a chilling reminder of that fact. In the summer of 2016, my wife and I, newlyweds after 12 years together, decided to spend the first few weeks of our marriage camping in the mountains. We'd enjoyed many trips to the mountains before, camping in various weather and staying in cozy lodges, so we booked a 20-day stay at a mountainside campground on the other side of the country. We also brought our dogs, who love the outdoors as much as we do. After 2 days of driving, we arrived, set up camp quickly, and settled in for what we hoped would be a peaceful stay. A few days into our trip, we met a range of fellow campers. As experienced campers, we often help novices with tools or supplies. On the 4th or 5th day, a woman, whom I'll call Samantha, made her appearance. We never learned her name, but her presence was unmistakable. While we were sitting under a large pine tree enjoying drinks and playing cards, she suddenly appeared. She asked if she could pet our dogs, but her unexpected appearance startled them. I politely declined, and she just stood there, not speaking or looking at anything in particular. After a few minutes, she walked away and set up a small tent in a nearby site that had been previously occupied by 2 young girls. They hadn't returned that day. The next morning, while heading to the showers, I saw Samantha sitting in her tent, reading a book with the door open. I didn't think much of it. When I returned from the shower, her tent was closed and shaking, indicating someone was inside. Then she stepped out of the tent completely nude and performed an elaborate stretch as if putting on a show. It was unsettling, but we shrugged it off and went on our hike to a nearby waterfall. On the trail, Samantha appeared again. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence since it was a common path. But when she stopped and just stood there, staring at us, I began to feel uneasy. My wife and I picked up the pace, trying to distance ourselves from her, but Samantha seemed to maintain a constant distance. It was becoming increasingly creepy, and we decided to cut our hike short and head back to camp. That night, while my wife was showering, she saw Samantha with the 2 girls from the earlier site. Samantha seemed to be trying to join them for a night out in the nearby ski town, but the girls were clearly mocking her. They revealed that Samantha had set up her tent on their site without permission, and they had tried to make her uncomfortable so she would leave. They hadn't reported her to the park warden because they were leaving the next day and didn't want to make a fuss. Around 3 a.m., we were jolted awake by a blood-curdling scream outside our camper. I looked outside and saw Samantha standing motionless on the path, staring in our direction. After a few tense moments, she turned and walked back to her tent. I locked the trailer and tried to calm down with a stiff drink before returning to sleep. The next day, our friends arrived to spend the weekend with us. Within minutes of their arrival, Samantha appeared in our sight again. She asked to pet our dog, who was barking at her. I declined and asked her to leave. She then started inspecting our friend's tent and offered to help set it up, which made everyone uncomfortable. When our friend declined her help, Samantha gave him a menacing look and abruptly left. That night, Samantha came over and surprisingly asked if she could stay with us. She suggested we could have fun together. My friend, slightly tipsy, responded with a crude comment. Samantha smiled at him and said she liked him before walking off into the darkness. We were all on edge, fearing she might return. Later, my wife noticed the site Samantha had occupied was a mess. It looked as though it had been ransacked. We reported the situation to Park Patrol, who were already investigating the site when we found them. On our last day, we went to a lookout point to enjoy the sunset. As we were taking photos, Samantha appeared once more, watching us from a distance. She walked up and sat beside us on a boulder without saying a word. My wife had the idea to take a photo of the scenery with Samantha in the background, just in case something happened. Reflecting on the experience, it was clear Samantha had serious social issues. Her behavior was far beyond normal awkwardness. The stalking, the midnight scream, and her general demeanor were unsettling. We managed to enjoy the rest of our trip without further incident, but Samantha's presence left a lasting impression. We decided to go camping this weekend. My husband, our 7-year-old daughter, and my 8-year-old niece. We've camped at this spot several times before without any issues, so we were looking forward to another peaceful getaway. Everything started off as usual. We arrived in the late afternoon, got our tent set up, and began preparing dinner. It was around 8 p.m., just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, when my daughter suddenly stopped what she was doing and stared behind me, her eyes wide with a mix of confusion and curiosity. She glanced back at me, then at whatever had caught her attention. I asked her what was wrong, and she simply told me to look behind me. I turned around and saw a little boy, no older than 6, standing a few feet away. He was just watching my daughter and niece as they played with a soccer ball. At first, I thought he was probably from one of the nearby campsites, curious about the game. My daughter, always the friendly one, invited him to join them, but instead of joining in, the boy bolted into the woods like a frightened animal. It was strange, but kids can be shy, so I didn't think much of it. I figured he'd return to his family's campsite. About 15 minutes later, as the darkness settled in, the boy reappeared. This time he lingered at the edge of our camp, just outside the circle of light from our lanterns. Something about him seemed off, so we asked where his parents were. His response sent a chill down my spine. He said he didn't have any. I was at a loss for words. My husband tried to get more information, asking if he was camping here. The boy's reaction was terrifying. He screamed at the top of his lungs that his parents were dead and that he was homeless living in the woods. The raw fear and anger in his voice were unnerving. I knew this wasn't safe or normal. I told him I was going to call someone to help him, hoping to get him out of the cold night and into a safe place. Surprisingly, he didn't resist. He seemed almost relieved and asked us to call for help because he didn't have a family. While we waited, I handed him some food and a Gatorade, trying to keep him calm. He accepted it and sat down on a log near the fire, silently staring into the flames. The minutes stretched out, and I kept glancing at the boy, trying to make sense of the situation. Something about him was unsettling, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The police arrived about 10 minutes later. As they approached, I could see the relief on their faces turn to concern as they got closer to the boy. They tried to talk to him, but before they could get more than a few words out, he suddenly jumped up and ran into the woods. As he disappeared into the darkness, he yelled back at us, saying his brother would be coming back for us. The officers immediately gave chase, their flashlights cutting through the trees. But the boy was quick, and soon the only sounds were the distant shouts of the police echoing through the forest. We stayed by the fire, tense and wide-eyed, waiting for any sign of what was happening. But the night swallowed everything. The police didn't come back, and the woods were silent. I couldn't shake the boy's final words from my mind. His brother would be coming back for us. Who was his brother, and why was he so certain that he would be back? We spent the rest of the night in a state of nervous vigilance. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes had us jumping, hearts pounding. The once peaceful forest now felt menacing, and the darkness seemed to hide countless threats. None of us slept that night, and as soon as dawn broke, we packed up and left the campsite. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with that boy. I'm haunted by the thought of what he might be running from, or who might be coming after him. I've camped many times in the past, but after this experience, I'm not sure I ever want to go back into the woods again. I set off into the mountains early yesterday morning with a sense of adventure. The site I chose was a remote campsite in a well-known mountain range near my home. With no Christmas plans to tie me down, I thought a solo camping trip would be a refreshing change. I hoped that the site would be quiet, and it was, though to my surprise I was the only one there. The day had been perfect. I enjoyed a long hike that left me exhausted. As the evening approached, I prepared to wind down. By 8 p.m., I had tidied up and crawled into my tent, ready for a good night's sleep. I fell asleep almost immediately, but my rest was abruptly interrupted at around 3:15 a.m. I awoke to the distinct sound of my tent's zipper being slowly pulled open. My instincts kicked in. As a light sleeper and a solo camper, I always kept my head near the entrance for just this kind of situation. The sound of the zipper grew louder, and I knew someone was trying to enter my tent. My heart raced, and my senses sharpened. I had brought a handgun with me for protection, a precaution I had never needed to use. My hands trembled as I reached for the weapon, but I knew I had to stay calm. I pointed the gun towards the entrance, my mind racing with possible scenarios. I decided to make my presence known, hoping to scare off whoever was outside. I shouted that I had a gun and would shoot if they didn't leave immediately. For a few agonizing seconds, there was silence. Then I heard hurried footsteps as someone ran away from the tent. My grip on the gun remained firm as I waited, ears straining for any further sounds. The minutes stretched endlessly as I kept the gun aimed at the entrance, my nerves on edge. Eventually, I reached for my phone and called the police. They told me it would take about 20 minutes for them to get there. I kept the gun ready and my eyes fixed on the tent entrance, my mind racing through the possibilities of what might happen next. The wait felt eternal. I was alone in the dark, every sound amplified by the silence of the mountains. I wondered who that intruder was and what they wanted. Did they have ill intentions, or was it a case of mistaken identity? Finally, I saw the headlights of the police vehicles approaching. Relief washed over me as I stepped out of the tent. I greeted the officers and gave them a detailed account of what had happened. They immediately began a search of the area. The search didn't take long, just 15 feet from where I had been waiting. The officers found a young man trying to hide behind a bare tree. In the stark light of their flashlights, it was clear that he was scared and disoriented. The sight of him huddled and shivering made me realize the gravity of the situation. The young man, likely in his early 20s, was clearly under the influence of something. The officers soon discovered that he had taken mushrooms at a campsite on the other side of the mountain. Lost and confused, he had wandered into my campsite, mistakenly thinking it was his own. As the police handcuffed him and led him to the patrol car, he turned to me and apologized, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry," he said. His words were swallowed by the cold, dark night. The officers asked if I wanted to press charges. Despite my anger and fear, I told them I didn't think it was necessary. I could see that he was just a young man who had made a poor decision while high. I knew that pressing charges wouldn't change what had happened or make me feel any safer. Even though the situation was resolved, I was shaken. The thought of someone trying to enter my tent in the middle of the night made it impossible to relax. I packed up my belongings quickly, feeling a mix of anger and unease. I couldn't stay there any longer. The sense of safety I had sought was now shattered. As I left the campsite, the chill of the mountain air seemed to echo the fear that had gripped me. The quiet of the mountains, once so peaceful, now felt unsettling. The adventure I had hoped for had turned into a nightmare, and I was eager to return to the safety of my home. The mountains, once a symbol of solitude and escape, had given me a story I would never forget.